Rachel Carter had never been the type to seek attention. She was a quiet, hardworking woman who had only been at Miller Enterprises for a few months. At 26, she was focused on keeping her job, paying her rent on time, and, most importantly, helping those who had even less than she did. Every evening, after long hours at her desk in the finance department, Rachel followed the same routine. She walked to Charlie's Corner Market, a small grocery store a few blocks away, and used part of her modest paycheck to buy food and essentials, packs of bread, juice, and granola bars. Then, she crossed the street to where a small group of homeless people gathered near the company's headquarters. "Rachel, it's good to see you," Henry, an elderly man with a scruffy gray beard, greeted her with a warm smile. Rachel knelt down, handing out the food with a familiar kindness. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we've got juice and granola bars." Their tired faces lit up as they received the food. Some shared quiet laughter, while others simply nodded their thanks. Rachel didn't expect gratitude. She didn't do this for recognition. She did it because it was the right thing to do. But what she didn't know was that Ethan Miller, the CEO of Miller Enterprises, had been watching her. From his corner office on the top floor, behind a wall of glass, Ethan had noticed her for several days now. At first, he assumed it was a coincidence. A young woman in professional attire, stopping to talk to the homeless. But as the days passed, he realized it wasn't a passing gesture, it was a routine, a commitment. Ethan Miller was not a man easily impressed. He was known for his sharp mind, ruthless business tactics, and unwavering focus on profits. He had built Miller Enterprises into a billion-dollar corporation by eliminating inefficiencies and demanding results. And yet, here was this employee, someone who barely made enough to cover her own living expenses, spending her time and money on people who could offer her nothing in return. "What does she get out of this?" he murmured to himself, narrowing his eyes as he watched Rachel smile at Henry and the others. It made no sense. Ethan had spent his entire career surrounded by people who only did things for personal gain. Employees worked hard for promotions. Business partners made deals for mutual profit. No one gave something for nothing. And yet, Rachel Carter defied that logic. That night, as Ethan left the office and walked toward his car, he saw her again, kneeling on the cold sidewalk, handing out food as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Miller drove home with something other than business on his mind. And he didn't like it. He needed to understand her. The next morning, Rachel Carter arrived at Miller Enterprises as she always did, right on time, ready to start another long day in the finance department. She spent most of the morning organizing reports, answering emails, and handling data for her direct supervisor. The work was demanding, but she never complained. She was grateful to have a job, even if it didn't leave much room for luxuries. As she focused on a spreadsheet, a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up, startled, and found Ethan Miller standing right in front of her. "Miss Carter," he said in his deep, no-nonsense tone. Rachel straightened her posture, quickly setting aside her pen. "Yes, Mr. Miller. How long have you been working here?" He crossed his arms, his gaze unreadable. Rachel swallowed. "A few months." Ethan nodded slowly, as if calculating something. "Do you like your job?" The question caught her off guard. Why was the CEO asking her this? It felt like a test. "Yes, I do," she answered carefully. "It's challenging, but I'm learning a lot." He studied her for a moment before giving a short nod. "Good. Keep it up." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving Rachel more confused than ever. That evening, As she left work, Rachel followed her usual routine, stopping by Charlie's Corner Market, buying snacks, and heading to the spot where the homeless community gathered. But this time, she wasn't alone. Ethan Miller had already left his office, yet instead of driving off immediately, he stood near his sleek black Cadillac Escalade, watching her. He had never met anyone like Rachel Carter. Most employees left work exhausted, eager to go home. They spent their paychecks on themselves, on things they wanted or needed. But Rachel, she spent her hard-earned money feeding people who had nothing. As he leaned against his car, arms crossed, he felt an unfamiliar irritation creeping in. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something else. Why did she do this? What did she gain from it? Ethan had always believed that people acted out of self-interest. Even charitable acts had motives, recognition, tax deductions, networking opportunities. But Rachel Carter wasn't seeking attention. She didn't expect gratitude. She just did it. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As he got into his car and pulled away, he found his mind lingering on her long after he left the city skyline behind. For the first time in years, something outside of business had captured his interest. And Ethan Miller was not a man who ignored things that intrigued him. The days passed, and Ethan Miller couldn't ignore the growing distraction that was Rachel Carter. It wasn't just her generosity, though that in itself was baffling enough, it was her consistency. Every night, without fail, she followed the same routine. She didn't just help the homeless occasionally, like someone trying to ease their conscience. No, she treated them like neighbors, like friends. Ethan found himself watching from his office window more often than he cared to admit. Each time, he tried to find a reason, a motive, a hidden agenda. But there was none. She wasn't looking for recognition, and she certainly wasn't trying to impress anyone. And that, more than anything, made him want to understand her. One afternoon, after a long meeting with department heads, Ethan made an unusual decision. He called for Rachel Carter. Sitting at her desk, Rachel nearly spilled her coffee when she received the message from Ethan's assistant. "Mr. Miller would like to see you in his office." Immediately. Her heart pounded. CEOs didn't call assistants into private meetings unless something was wrong. Had she made a mistake in her reports? Was she about to be fired? She took a deep breath, grabbed her notepad, and made her way to the 35th floor. The executive wing was silent, pristine, and intimidating. Ethan's assistant motioned for her to go inside. Rachel stepped in and found Ethan Miller sitting behind his massive oak desk, his sharp blue eyes fixed on her. "Close the door," he said. She obeyed, standing stiffly in front of him. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Miller?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that made her feel like she was under a microscope. Finally, he spoke. "Every night, after work, I see you buying food. I see you handing it out to the homeless. Why do you do it?" Rachel blinked, stunned. Of all the things she expected, this was not one of them. She hesitated before answering. "Because I can." Ethan's brow furrowed. "That's not an answer." Rachel shrugged. "If I were in their position, I'd want someone to do the same for me. Besides, it's a small thing, but it makes a difference." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You spend your money on strangers. You sacrifice your time. And for what?" Rachel smiled slightly. "Not everything has to be about getting something in return, Mr. Miller." He was silent for a moment, drumming his fingers against the desk. The concept seemed foreign to him. Finally, he leaned forward. "You do this every night?" Yes. He let out a slow breath. Unbelievable. Rachel wasn't sure if that was an insult or not. Then, to her surprise, Ethan nodded and said, "You're dismissed." Rachel stood there for a moment, processing the bizarre conversation. Then, realizing he wasn't going to say anything else, she turned and left. That evening, as Rachel left the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She wasn't sure what Ethan's interest meant, but for some reason, she had a feeling this wasn't the last time he would ask about her after-work routine. And she was right. Up in his office, Ethan Miller stood at his window, watching as Rachel handed out food, laughing with the homeless like they were old friends. For the first time in years, something about his world didn't make sense. And he wasn't sure he liked that. By the end of the month, Rachel Carter had settled into a steady rhythm at Miller Enterprises. She worked tirelessly in the finance department, her days filled with spreadsheets, emails, and reports. But no matter how exhausted she was, she never skipped her evening routine, stopping at Charlie's Corner Market, buying food, and distributing it to those in need. She never thought twice about it. It was just something she did. But Ethan Miller did think about it. In fact, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Every night, he watched from his office, his curiosity turning into something he couldn't quite define. He wasn't just intrigued anymore, he was unsettled. Because for all his wealth, for all his business success, he had never seen someone like Rachel Carter. That Friday, something different happened. It was payday. Rachel had been waiting for this moment, her first real paycheck since starting the job. She wasn't making a fortune, but it was enough to pay her rent, cover some overdue bills, and buy groceries for the month. At least, that was the plan. As she left work that evening, she thought about Henry, the elderly man who had been living on the streets for years, always polite, always kind. His coat was torn, his shoes barely holding together. Then there was Margaret, who slept under a thin blanket, and Jake, the young man in his 20s who always talked about getting off the streets but never seemed to catch a break. Rachel glanced down at her phone, checking her bank balance. Before she knew it, her feet had changed course. Instead of going home, she walked into Benny's discount store and bought a warm coat and a pair of sturdy shoes for Henry. She added a thick blanket for Margaret and picked up some essentials for Jake and the others. Then, she went to the grocery store and bought enough food to make sure they all had a proper meal that night. By the time she stepped out of the store, her wallet was practically empty. But her heart was full. "Rachel, this is too much," Henry said, his voice cracking as he held the new coat in his trembling hands. Margaret clutched the thick blanket to her chest, shaking her head. "I don't even know how to thank you." Jake, who always tried to act tough, looked down at his new sneakers and muttered, This is gonna help me get a job." Rachel just smiled. "You don't have to thank me. You do the same for me." That night, there was more laughter among the small group than usual. Rachel sat with them longer than normal, talking and sharing in their joy. But when she finally checked the time, she realized something important. She had no money left to get home. Rachel took a deep breath and decided to walk. How far could it be? 30 minutes later, she had her answer. Her feet ached in her uncomfortable work shoes, the night air was getting colder, and the streets were getting quieter. She was pulling her thin coat tighter around her when a sleek black Cadillac Escalade pulled up beside her. The tinted window rolled down, and there he was. Ethan Miller. He raised an eyebrow. "How far are you planning to walk?" Rachel hesitated. Of all people, why did it have to be him? "Home," she said casually, trying not to let her exhaustion show. Ethan glanced at the empty sidewalk ahead of her. You live far?" She nodded. There was a pause. Then he sighed and unlocked the car door. "Get in." Rachel hesitated. Taking a ride from the CEO of the company didn't seem like the best idea. But honestly, her feet were killing her. She got in. The warmth of the car was immediate, and Rachel let out an involuntary sigh of relief. Ethan drove in silence for a few minutes before glancing at her. "Why are you walking home?" She bit her lip, debating whether to tell the truth. But what was the point in lying? "I kind of spent all my money," she admitted. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "You got paid today?" "Yes." "And you already spent everything?" She nodded. "On what?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before answering, "Helping the homeless." The car went completely silent. She turned to look at him, and to her surprise, he was staring at her like she had just said something completely unbelievable. "You spent your entire paycheck on strangers?" She let out a small, awkward laugh. "When you put it that way, it sounds like a terrible financial decision." Ethan blinked a few times. "Because it is." Rachel crossed her arms and looked out the window. "Not to me." Ethan kept his eyes on the road, but she could tell he was processing what she had just said. After a few seconds, he took a deep breath. "Do you at least have money for rent?" Rachel smiled slightly, looking away. "No. But I'll figure it out." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbelievable. You're really..." He stopped mid-sentence. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "I'm really what?" "Different." She blinked. Was that a compliment? The rest of the ride was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. When they finally pulled up in front of her apartment building, Rachel let out a relieved sigh. "Thanks for the ride, Mr. Miller." Ethan studied her for a moment. "If you're going to keep spending your money like this, at least let me know. I'll cover your ride home." Rachel laughed, shaking her head. "I'll manage. I always do." She opened the door and stepped out, but before entering the building, she turned to him and said something that made Ethan Miller sit in his car for several minutes after she was gone. "Good night, Mr. Miller. And thank you for caring." Ethan frowned as he watched her disappear inside. And then it hit him. He actually cared. But why? Ethan Miller didn't like distractions. His life was structured, efficient, and focused on results. Every minute of his day was carefully planned: meetings, reports, calls with investors, strategic decisions. He had built Miller Enterprises into a billion-dollar empire because he didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. And yet, all weekend, his mind kept drifting back to Rachel Carter. It wasn't just what she had done, it was the way she had done it. She hadn't hesitated to spend every last dollar of her paycheck on people who had nothing to offer her in return. She hadn't complained about walking home in the cold, nor had she even considered asking for help. Rachel Carter had done what she believed was right, without expecting anything in return. And Ethan Miller didn't know how to process that. By Monday, Ethan was back in his office, trying to focus on quarterly projections. But something gnawed at him, refusing to let go. At 9:02 a.m., Rachel walked into the office as if nothing had happened. She greeted the receptionist with a warm smile, took her seat at her desk, and got straight to work. No one else seemed to notice anything different about her. But Ethan did. For the next 2 hours, he tried to concentrate. He reviewed financial reports, answered emails, even sat through a meeting with the board of directors. None of it helped. By 11:15 a.m., he finally gave in. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Call Rachel Carter to my office. Now." Rachel was reviewing a spreadsheet when the message arrived. Her stomach twisted slightly. Again? Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the 35th floor. She knocked lightly before stepping in. Ethan was leaning against his desk, arms crossed. His sharp blue eyes studied her, unreadable as always. "Close the door." Rachel obeyed. Ethan was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I want to understand something." She tilted her head. "All right. Why do you do it?" Rachel frowned. "Do what?" Ethan exhaled, clearly irritated, not at her, but at his own inability to comprehend. "Why do you spend your money on people who will never pay you back? Why do you sacrifice your own comfort for them?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, she shrugged. "Because I can." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." Rachel crossed her arms. "It's the truth. I do it because I can, because I know no one else will, and because," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because if I were in their place, I'd want someone to do the same for me." Ethan watched her closely. "But you have no obligation to help them." Rachel nodded. "Since when do we need an obligation to do the right thing?" The room was silent. Ethan studied her, his mind working through the words. He was a man who understood business, deals, incentives. But what Rachel had just said didn't follow any of those principles. And yet, he couldn't argue with it. Finally, he let out a slow breath and leaned back against his desk. "You're unbelievable." Rachel gave him a small smile. "I hear that a lot." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his $5,000 tailored suit. "You know you can't keep living like this," he said flatly. "Spending all your money and putting yourself in difficult situations." Rachel shrugged. "I'll figure it out." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You say that like it's a good thing." She tilted her head. "It's worked so far." He sighed, shaking his head. Then, without another word, he reached into his desk drawer, pulled out an envelope, and placed it on the table. Rachel frowned. "What's that?" Ethan crossed his arms. "Your paycheck. With a bonus." Rachel's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "Because you deserve it." She blinked, staring at the envelope. Finally, she let out a small laugh. "Is this your way of telling me to stop helping the homeless?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "No. It's my way of making sure you don't have to choose between helping others and taking care of yourself." Rachel felt her throat tighten slightly. She looked down at the envelope, then back at Ethan. And for the first time, she saw something different in his gaze. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. Ethan Miller cared. And that terrified her more than she was willing to admit. Rachel Carter had never been the type to rely on others. She had built her life on independence, figuring things out as she went, and never expecting help from anyone, especially not from Ethan Miller, the billionaire CEO of Miller Enterprises. And yet, over the past few weeks, something had changed. Ethan wasn't just watching her anymore. He was paying attention to how hard she worked, to the sacrifices she made, and most unsettling of all, to the fact that she never seemed to expect anything in return. She had tried to ignore it. She had convinced herself that whatever curiosity he had about her would fade. But deep down, she knew better. And that Friday night, in the middle of a rainstorm, she realized just how much things had shifted. Rachel had just finished her work for the day when the rain started. It wasn't a light drizzle, it was a full downpour, the kind that soaked everything in minutes. She stood under the awning outside Miller Enterprises, watching the rain slam against the pavement. She had an umbrella in her bag, but it was small and barely useful in this kind of weather. Still, she sighed, adjusted her coat, and stepped out. She had made a promise, to herself and to the people waiting for her across the street. Rain or not, they needed her. Rachel hurried to Charlie's Corner Market, bought the usual food and supplies, and headed toward the familiar alley where Henry, Margaret, and Jake were likely waiting. She was already drenched by the time she reached them, but she didn't care. "Rachel," Henry said, shaking his head. "You're gonna catch a cold out here." Rachel just smiled as she handed him a warm meal. "I'll be fine." She didn't notice the black Cadillac Escalade pull up behind her. Ethan Miller sat in his car, watching the scene unfold. He had been leaving the office when he spotted Rachel, soaked, standing in the pouring rain, handing out food with that same unshakable kindness he still couldn't fully comprehend. He clenched his jaw. Without thinking twice, he stepped out of the car, ignoring the rain soaking through his expensive suit. Rachel didn't notice him until he was standing right beside her. She blinked in surprise. "Mr. Miller?" Ethan glanced at the group of homeless people, then back at her. "Are you seriously standing in the rain for this?" Rachel crossed her arms. "I'm not going to let bad weather stop me." Ethan exhaled, then did something she never expected. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his car keys, and held them out to her. "Take the car." Rachel stared at him. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Ethan's voice was firm. "If you're going to keep doing this, at least do it without ruining your health. Take my car." Rachel let out a disbelieving laugh. "You can't be serious." Ethan didn't flinch. "I am." For the first time, Rachel didn't know what to say. And for the first time, Ethan Miller realized that he wasn't just watching her anymore. He was invested. Rachel Carter wasn't used to accepting help. She had spent most of her life figuring things out on her own, making ends meet, stretching her paycheck, and ensuring that no matter how little she had, she could still help those in need. So when Ethan Miller, the CEO of Miller Enterprises, handed her the keys to his Cadillac Escalade in the middle of a rainstorm, she didn't know how to react. The offer was absurd. A billionaire lending his car to an assistant? It didn't make sense. But then again, nothing about Ethan Miller's recent behavior made sense. Rachel shook her head, stepping back. "I appreciate it, Mr. Miller, but I can't take your car." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Why not?" She gestured toward the group of homeless people behind her. "Because that's not how this works. I don't do this for comfort or convenience. I do it because it's the right thing to do." Ethan exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. "So you'd rather stand in the rain, ruin your shoes, and risk getting sick than accept help?" Rachel folded her arms. "I'd rather stay true to why I do this in the first place." For a long moment, Ethan just stared at her. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "I hear that a lot." Ethan shook his head, slipping his keys back into his pocket. "Fine. Have it your way." The rain was still coming down hard as Ethan ran a hand through his wet hair. His expensive suit was soaked, his polished shoes were ruined, and yet, for some reason, he didn't care. Rachel had just rejected his help without hesitation. And that, more than anything, made him want to test her even more. "All right," he said suddenly. Since you don't like accepting things, let's make a deal." Rachel frowned. "What kind of deal?" "You work in finance. You know numbers," Ethan said, crossing his arms. "Prove to me that you can cut company costs by 10% next quarter, and I'll personally fund your efforts here." Rachel's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "You heard me." His voice was firm. "If you're so determined to help people, let's see if you can do it on a bigger scale. Show me you can make an impact inside the company, and I'll support what you're doing outside of it." Rachel stared at him, completely caught off guard. This wasn't what she expected. Not even close. But as she looked into Ethan Miller's sharp, calculating gaze, she realized something. This was a test. And she never backed down from a challenge. The rain poured around them, but Rachel barely noticed. She held out her hand. "Deal." Ethan's smirk widened as he shook it. "Let's see what you've got, Carter." And just like that, Rachel Carter had entered a game she never saw coming. Life often teaches us that success is measured by what we earn, but true fulfillment comes from what we give. Rachel Carter's story reminds us that kindness is not about convenience, it's about commitment. She didn't wait for the perfect conditions to help others. She saw a need and acted, even when it meant sacrificing her own comfort. For many of us, especially as we grow older, we start to reflect on what truly matters. It's not the wealth we accumulate, but the impact we leave behind. Rachel's unwavering generosity challenged Ethan Miller, a man who had spent his life chasing financial success, to rethink his values. In helping others, she not only transformed their lives, she also changed him. This story teaches us two valuable lessons. First, generosity has the power to inspire. Acts of kindness, no matter how small, create ripples that extend beyond what we can see. Second, growth comes from embracing challenges. Ethan tested Rachel not to discourage her, but to push her towards something greater. And isn't that how we grow in life? By facing challenges with courage, by staying true to our principles, and by never underestimating the difference we can make. No matter our age, we can all ask ourselves, what legacy are we leaving? How are we choosing to give? Because in the end, success isn't just about what we achieve, it's about how we lift others along the way.